Our guest today is the former dean of the Annenberg School of Communication at the University of Pennsylvania in Philadelphia. Professor Delli Carpini, it is really a pleasure to have you in our program, UN Brief. We are starting a new model of communications, of broadcast, Twitter timelines, and we are trying this format using Zoom, where we can interview people all over the globe and post in our social media platforms as well. So I would like to start today by talking with you about your books. Media Matters and so many others that you walk us through a bit your research, your long history in researching media politics and how they influence public policy.
I'd be happy to do that. You want me to talk just a little bit at the beginning about my overall research agenda? I'd be happy to do that. So I'm trained as a political scientist, although I am now in a school of communication, and my broad area of research and teaching has been what's the role of the media in facilitating or inhibiting the ability of citizens to engage in meaningful ways in the political world, and in particular, for them to be able to do it in a way that enhances the way democracies work. And most of my work is focused on the United States, but the broader topics really apply to any modern developed democratic system. And so I've looked at that in a bunch of different ways. One of the things I've focused on in my research, most centrally in a book that I co-authored with Scott Keeter, is the importance of facts, of political information in the ability of citizens to be able to make meaningful decisions and engage in meaningful ways. We wrote that book quite some time ago, and we made the argument that when citizens as individuals and groups are informed about politics in a broad sense of the word, that they are, quote, better citizens, they are better able to connect their opinions to their political actions. They're better able to understand the views of others, be more tolerant. They are more engaged, more participatory, all the kinds of things that we associate with a engaged, informed, active citizenry that can make democracy work the way it's supposed to, is associated with the ability of citizens to get good, useful information about politics. Now, I mentioned that we wrote that quite some time ago because it has obviously become a very hot topic again, excuse me, in this world that we live in, where disinformation which has always been around, but is around in a way that it makes it incredibly difficult for people to know what to believe and what not to believe. And we could talk in more detail about that if you'd like. The other piece of my work that I'll talk about.
That's something I've noticed too, and that when I brought up, I was in the UK during the referendum to leave the EU, and I remember seeing all the campaigns online, and I thought, this is not quite right, this is propaganda, there is a propaganda machine behind. And then people would say, oh, that's been always like that in politics. These are campaigns, political campaigns. And I was a bit surprised that people weren't aware that there is a new form of disseminating this information being amplified by bots, through the social media platforms that created this very, very chaotic environment.
Absolutely true what you're saying. Both the sort of the unwillingness to accept that things are different because there is no question that they're different, but also the role that this new digital media environment that we live in plays in this. So, and it's not just in campaigns. I mean, there's a lot of attention appropriately paid to the role that the Russians and the Russian government played in spreading disinformation in the United States during the 2016 election cycle and since then. That's important. But what's missed when you focus only on that is that much of this disinformation is also being disseminated directly and indirectly by other actors in the United States, whether it's conservative media or whether it is conservative fringe groups, that they are complicitous in spreading this information. And most depressingly, that our own current administration is complicitous in spreading this information. You saw it during the campaign. You've seen it throughout the presidency of Donald Trump. And you see it even as we try to deal with the COVID-19 pandemic that's taking place right now. What seems to have changed dramatically is that misinformation, disinformation can be said. But what's even also dramatic about it is that it can be countered and corrected, and no one seems to pay a price for the misinformation, and people still believe the disinformation. It's as if facts no longer matter. I mean, that's a bit of an overstatement, but only a bit of an overstatement.
Indeed, because the people take action based on the things they see that are false, the fake news they see. People who are impressionable or people who don't have, haven't benefited of having a media literacy, or who don't have media literacy, right? We say. So it is really a challenge to work in this environment, and particularly now during the COVID-19 crisis, we are seeing again bots coming out, extreme right groups paying for campaigns on social media platforms. Well, social media platforms have been coming up to the task of being a bit more responsible corporate citizens, right? But there's still much to be done.
In fairness, it's a hard issue, right? I mean, because you can slip. Sometimes we're so worried about the current problem that in finding solutions, we forget that we might create other problems, right? And so I worry as much about limiting free speech and limiting access to information from different points of view as I do about the role of misinformation and disinformation. So we've got to coming up with a good system that could limit the amount of disinformation always runs the risk of throwing the baby out with the bathwater, if you will, and creating an environment where things people should be hearing, ideas, areas where we're really not sure what the real facts are, could wind up getting censored by that as well. But having said that, you are absolutely right that we, especially in an environment like the United States, where there's already so little regulation, we really need these major platforms like Google and Facebook and Amazon, other places that are the disseminators of information. They've got to really think through hard what is appropriate and not appropriate to have posted, and how one controls that in a way that's effective. But another way of doing this, or an additional way of doing this, is we've also got to get better at helping people be able to distinguish what is disinformation and what is not, and to be able to counter better when disinformation flows through the system, more quickly and effectively counter that information with factual information. And those are really, really hard things to do.
They are, but there seems to be, they have been working with the WHO here in Geneva, actually. So there seems to be a movement towards good corporate citizenship in some ways. Yeah. But I would like to talk now about your last book too, the environment, how it's changing, because I was looking at some of the material and it's so still relevant, even if the book was published 8 years ago, right?
Yeah, that's right, yeah.
I think Facebook was maybe 7, 8, 9, 10 years old. Yeah. But we have seen so much change in the impact, in traditional media, in the blurring of entertainment and news. I thought it was quite interesting too.
That's right. This book, which, as you said, is like 8 or 9 years old now. Was an effort by myself and a colleague who teaches at University of Virginia, Bruce Williams, to try to get our hands around what was changing in the media environment. And we make the argument, that media environments change. I mean, that's an obvious point. And we sometimes compare what we have now to the most immediate environment that we're coming out of. And that's what we saw happening. So we argue that there are these things called media regimes. And these media regimes are systems that are in place in which the relationship between the media, the technology of the media, political leaders, and citizens have certain rules and expectations as to how you interact. And there, in the United States, we've had several of these different regimes, but the one that we're most familiar with that we were coming out of was the era of broadcast media, where media was very centralized. The entire US population, for example, really depended on 3 or 4 news outlets on broadcast television and maybe a newspaper in their local community to get information. And the role of journalists was to be gatekeepers of that information, to tell us what was important to think about and know about. And they were also, in theory, supposed to be relatively objective to the extent that they could be, and fair and balanced to the extent that they could be. And then citizens' job was to consume that information and vote occasionally, and pay attention enough that they could act. They understood in broad strokes what was going on. But for a variety of reasons, driven in large part by technology, but not exclusively by technology, we've gone through a period since the late 1990s, really through the early 2000s, where that model no longer applied, even though we didn't know what the new model was going to be. And that's the moment that we were writing this book. We were writing it when it was clear that the media environment had changed, but nobody was sure what its implications were going to be. And so what we tried to do was describe what we thought was going on. And the key parts of what we thought were different were that there was, unlike the age of broadcast news of the late 20th century, that there was a new blurring of news and entertainment, that distinction was beginning to stop making a difference, that there was a blurring of fact and opinion, that what was a fact and what was an opinion was less clear, or was emerging as less clear in this new environment, that there was a shift in producers and consumers, that citizens suddenly could be the producers of information, not as powerfully as the mainstream media, but certainly you can think of all kinds of examples of where average citizens holding a handheld camera have shaped the media agenda, and a couple of other kind of shifts like that. And at the time, we gave some examples of how we saw that happening. But I can tell you that if we had predicted that that what's going on now would be the result of this, because we do think it's a result of the shifting media environment, we wouldn't have been able to get the book published. It seems like this is science fiction. This is a novel. This couldn't happen. And yet it's exactly the kinds of things that we thought were going to happen.
No,
and I'll just say one other thing is that we make the argument in other work that Donald Trump's victory was because, in a weird kind of way, either just sort of implicitly or explicitly, he understood this new environment better than most people, and he was able to exploit it in ways that allowed him to become president of the United States.
Absolutely, yes. That is key. It's what most people don't realize. Wasn't a surprise. If you were studying the news media environment, looking at its change and marketing techniques and advertising, micro-targeting, social media campaigns, how they work, behavioral marketing, you would understand very well that this is happening.
That's right.
This election was somewhat not, you could even say fraudulent, because they used the techniques that I'm not sure, but there is no legislation too that would say, well, you can't do that, right?
I mean, one of the ways we put
legislation that will say certain things they did in social media, because they told the outright lies. Some people would say, oh, but Obama used the same methods, you know, of behavioral targeting, behavioral marketing, using Facebook as a platform to reach for potential voters. But I don't think Obama came out and made like this absurd horror like stories about his opponents, the opponents, right? No. He just said, well, I'm good for this is my policies, maybe responded to criticism from the opposition, but he never put blatant lies. And this campaign actually made the horrible, you know, pictures defacing the candidate Hillary Clinton. I mean, that was pretty odd.
No, I mean, all those points are exactly right. And one of the things that's become clear is that so much of the US system, at least working as it should, was not based on rules and law, although those are really, really important. They were based on norms. The expectation that that people in positions of power would stay within certain norms and bounds. So you can disagree on opinions, you can disagree on policies, you can even choose some facts over the other to make your case. But what Donald Trump has shown us, and the Trump administration and this new environment has shown us, is that if you want to, you can even make things up. And you can make those things up, and you can be called on the carpet for making them up, and you still pay no political price for them. You can still, at least what you wind up doing is you leave people confused. They don't know what to believe. And once you've done that, you suddenly have, I think at the same time that you might be able to push your own personal agenda forward, you wind up deeply damaging the core elements of what a democracy needs if it's going to function effectively. And I think that's what's happening right now, at least in the United States.
Yes, and of course, also the question of journalism. Why journalism, right? Why do we need journalists, actually? Because everybody can be, you know, a journalist. You know, they simply say, okay, I'm going to tell stories, and there are so many, you know, from all across the political spectrum who decide they are going to tell stories, and this is the news. But they are not journalists, because the idea, a journalist has some sort of ethical framework, right, that you work with.
Yeah.
And this ethical framework is what we don't see. I see often, you know, particularly in the world of venture capital and new technologies and startups, people start writing a blog and they say, well, this is the news now. This is my news outlet. I have my own brand, my own news outlet. But there's a difference between having a certain sense of that you are, maybe as a news organization, really, or a news producer, you have to have some sort of ethical framework that you work from.
Those are all exactly right. In some ways, journalists are less important, or professional journalists are less important and more important than they've ever been. They're less important for all the reasons you mentioned, that for anything I read or hear from a professional journalist, even one doing their jobs really well, there's some place I can, with one click of my mouse, I can find information that contradicts that and is coming from a different point of view and is not factual and is misleading. And so we in the book that you referred to that I wrote with Bruce Williams, we call this multi-axiality. The idea is that journalists are no longer the only gatekeepers of information, or at least not as strong as they used to be. And instead, we get information from so many different places and the information is so different in what it focuses on, but also its veracity, we live in this confusing information environment. But they're more important than ever precisely because that we need professional journalists to at least curate that information, professional journalists who have norms and ethics and training in the way you described. And that doesn't necessarily mean not having opinions, but it does mean that opinions have to be tethered to actual facts. You can't debate things if you don't even agree on the basic facts. And that's one of the roles professional journalists could play. But in the world we live in now, especially, at least again in the United States, trust in the mainstream media is at its lowest points that it's ever been measured. And so people don't even trust professional journalists when they're told something. If you don't trust the source, then you're free to decide on your own what facts you believe and what facts you don't. And it's a very confusing, difficult environment to try to have any kind of a sense of political community in.
Yes, particularly because the news media, the traditional news media, is being attacked constantly by the commander-in-chief, and then so many pundits right and left saying, oh, the demise completely. And then professional journalists have to keep reminding themselves, have a compromise with
That's right.
with truth, with bringing facts to people, right, to our public. So there is this public service aspect, right? Of
yes, and there are. I want to be clear. There are journalists. At many news outlets in the United States, print and broadcast and online, that are doing a very good job in trying to do exactly that. But their voices often, well, two things happen. Their voices often get washed out by all the other information that's floating and disinformation that's floating around. But also, they have been targeted as, quote, fake news. So it's ironic that fake news for some people has come to mean true news. That because President Trump has been very, very effective at convincing his followers that what is being said by more mainstream professional journalists is simply wrong, is not true. And it seems to be hard to convince them that that's not the case.
Indeed, indeed. And what is happening now at the university? How are classes going? What is changing now? What are the perspectives?
We are all virtual. I mean, I don't think I knew, and I'm ashamed to admit this as a communications professor, I don't think I knew what Zoom was before the last 6 weeks or 7 weeks. But all students are off. I'll talk about University of Pennsylvania where I teach, but this is true at all universities and colleges. The campuses are closed down. There are very few campuses where even the faculty or staff go to the campus, that they're literally closed down. That varies a little bit, but right now Penn is shut down. Literally the campus is almost completely empty, except for a few very central personnel. Students have gone home or found other places to stay. There's my students in a 100-person undergraduate class that I teach have scattered across the globe. They're everywhere from China to Africa, to other parts of Asia, to the West and East and South and North in the United States. All classes have continued, but they've continued either through Zoom or Zoom-like apps that allow for live discussion and lectures, or they are recorded lectures that have been posted on various websites to allow students to complete their semester. I'm happy to say that the 2 courses I'm teaching, I'm in the midst of grading those exams now. They completed, and the students have been incredibly great in adjusting to the issue and the new circumstances. And I'll also say that it's probably not a better time to teach media-related courses, because everything that's going on has a media component to it. So the papers are all about disinformation, the way the media is covering the COVID-19 pandemic, the way in which in the United States, Asian Americans and China are being stereotyped and villainized because of what's going on. So the papers all are about contemporary issues using classic theories and research. That's been positive. But we are all in a holding pattern. I don't think anybody knows whether summer classes have been all turned to online classes, and when nobody knows whether the fall semester will start with students and faculty and staff back on campus or not. We're kind of in a holding pattern. And for a number of colleges and universities that are heavily tuition dependent, it could very well be that some of those colleges don't really survive this. So higher education is, I think, up in the air right now.
But it's good. Well, universities such as the University of Pennsylvania can adapt quite quickly to everything online, and the students too. I believe you want to graduate in time, I guess.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I feel bad for the seniors who they're graduate. Usually, the last, as you probably know, the last month or so of a senior's experience at college is a combination of finishing up your courses, but also looking forward to the rest of your life, saying your goodbyes to friends that you might not see anymore, celebrating your accomplishments, and all that was unfortunately lost for these students. So I feel really bad about that. But again, and I can't imagine for even younger kids that are in high school or grade school, elementary school, who are going through this as a formative part of their experience, how they're thinking about what this means for the world that they live in. But I've been impressed the way most, certainly not all, certainly not that group of Americans who are out on the streets in large groups protesting the social distancing and the shutting down of businesses. Well, I understand the problems there. The reaction has been unfortunate, but the vast majority of the public, I think, has really stepped up to the plate in this moment and is trying to address what's going on, though it has really highlighted what we already knew about the inequities in American society, in which people with fewer resources or who have never really been fully accepted into the community are suffering more than the rest of us.
And what about your PhD students? Are they sort of, what's the challenge there? And
you know, I also taught a PhD course this semester, and I'm close, because I was former dean, close to a lot of the students. They're stressed. You know, in terms of the classes, I think those have all gone fine. But for example, we have PhD students who are working on their dissertations, whose work was more ethnographic or interview based, and their design of their studies were to go out and talk to people or attend different types of meetings, and they can't do that. And so they're on hold. We have students who are about to go onto the academic job market, and you can be fairly certain that there's not going to be a lot of hiring over the next, who knows, period of time, as universities worry about their financial circumstances because of possibility of tuition being dropped, tuition revenues being dropped, and the endowments of universities going down. So it's going to be hard for students who are going out on the job market. So yeah, but again, in a media program, it also presents opportunities for thinking about how to study the kinds of media environment that we live in right now. But in general, I would say most people, most students are dealing with it, but pretty stressed out about what this means for their future.
Well, thank you very much, Professor Michael Delli Carpini, former Dean of the Annenberg School of Communication at the University of Pennsylvania, and Professor at the Communications School still, right? And
Sure.
as the Political Science Department. It was a pleasure speaking with you, and I hope we can be in touch whenever I need a commentary on things that are...
I'd be happy to do this. Congratulations on this format, and also on the work that you're doing. I think it's really important at this moment. And I think you can't think about these issues without thinking about the role of technology in it. And so it's a really important role you're filling now. So thank you for that.
Yes, as much as it took us by surprise too, again, because I'm covering the United Nations here. So our work was like, there are events every day, you know, so I was on the hallways talking to different experts and government representatives, and suddenly they are not here. We can't access the building. So we thought, well, this is going to be the solution. And it looks like also we a new format for us to deliver.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Yeah. Okay. Well, take care. It's great to see you, and stay safe.
Yes, you too. Thank you very much.
Yep. Bye-bye.